We're ready? Yeah, ready to start? Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining this official Stockholm+50 side event, which we have called a healthy planet through gender-just recovery. And it's a great honor to moderate this session today on behalf of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform Gender Expert Group, which is a group of leading international green growth and green economy institutions, which was formed on the GGKP platform in 2021. My name is Ingvild Solvang, and I am the Deputy Director and Head of Climate Action and Inclusive Development from the Global Green Growth Institute. That's a mouthful. And I'm also co-chair of the Gender Expert Group, together with representatives from the IIED and from UNEP. And it's a great pleasure to host a stage here at Stockholm+50 to discuss the necessity to ensure gender-just recovery through gender-just transitions. And recovery and transitions, there is movement in those words, right? Because Stockholm+50 is now at a crossroad where all reliable signs are pointing towards a shift away from business as usual, away from hollow promises and talk only, towards action that also upholds the principle of leaving no one behind, while avoiding trying to tackle different challenges in silos. So bringing together the human and the environmental dimensions when we talk about sustainable development. And the problem is that that way hasn't quite yet been paved yet, although it has been 50 years since Stockholm in 1972. So here we are again to talk about how do we do this? How do we bring in gender equality and social inclusion when we talk about recovery and just transitions? So to start the conversation with a bit of the broad perspective, I wish to hand the screen to former Secretary General of the United Nations, who also now is GGGI's President and Chair, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. So please, the video.
As the movement for an inclusive green economy continues to grow, and we enter the final decade of action on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the collaboration among global partners is more important than ever. The theme of this Stockholm+50 meeting, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity, calls for renewed global efforts to protect and restore nature. We all should demand strong leadership and action from our governments, businesses, cities, investors, and other stakeholders to create a healthy and sustainable future. The climate crisis is too big for just one country, one industry, or one age group. And no one country, industry, or demographic group is immune from its consequences. We all need to work together to steer away from driving off a cliff together. The key is through collaboration and collective actions at the global and national levels, to communal and household levels, spanning beyond the national borders, industries, and societal boundaries. We can still transform our economies and societies towards a sustainable and inclusive future, but only if we work together. Thank you.
So thank you to His Excellency Ban Ki-moon for that introduction. Just a little bit about the session today. We will have 2 keynote speakers before we have a panel discussion. We also have quite a large audience joining us virtually, so I also want to wish them very welcome and thank them for joining us today. So a little bit about the gender expert group. The pandemic-19 and climate change, as we know, laid bare existing inequalities in societies, the differences between rich and poor men and women who are disproportionately, differently impacted by the planetary crisis that we are facing. We are seeing a setback now, and that against the backdrop where the World Economic Forum has estimated that we now need about 136 years to close the gender gap. Which, if you ask me, is a little bit too long. So we need to accelerate gender equality, and we need to, because we know that it leads to better solutions. As a gender expert group of leading green growth, green economy institutions, we have found that we are actually facing quite a few challenges in promoting and really in meaningful ways ensuring that gender equality is brought into the policies and the pipelines that we are supporting at local level and with our partner and member governments around the world. And this is also consistent with some of the findings of the large climate financial institutions, for example, where it seems as if we have become quite good at checking the box at entry when we start to design projects and we make decisions about where the financing should go. We are quite good at saying, oh yeah, sure, we have considered gender in this project. But the question is, are we really ensuring that we follow that through the entire program cycle all the way to actually achieving real impacts? That's the question. So in the discussion today, we have invited representatives from different types of actors in this space to discuss what gender just recovery and gender just transitions look like from different perspectives. And very first, I wish to invite the president of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, Dr. Salimul Hook, who has been around, and I don't know, Dr. Hook, whether you have missed any of the UNFCCC COPs in your entire career. He's been to all of them. So I thought it would be a great place to start, to have him talk a little bit about how he has seen gender evolve on this agenda. Please, Dr. Hook.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ingvild, and good evening to everybody. So as you just heard, I happen to be one of the elder statesman, if you like, of this journey. I wasn't in Stockholm 50 years ago, but I was in Rio 30 years ago at the 1992 Earth Summit. And as Ingvild just mentioned, I've been attending every single conference of parties of the UN Framework Convention ever since then. So 30 years in the environment business. And I'm also a scientist. I was a member of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for several assessment reports. And I was also a member of the science group that did the report on Stockholm+50, which came out yesterday, which I'll cite because very important finding of the scientific community looking at back 50 years from the Stockholm Conference in 1972 at the myriad different streams of environmental actions, conventions, agreements that we have signed and said that we were going to abide by and implement. The good news is we've done a lot. The bad news is we've done not enough by any means. Only 10% of what we had promised to do have we been able to do. That is not a good assessment. That is not something that we want to continue to do. And you know, the saying goes that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting that it'll have a new result. And I think we're at that stage. We're just doing the same thing over and over again, and we're expecting this time it will work, but it's not going to work. So I'm just going to share with you 3 ideas of what I call reversing the way we've been doing things, acknowledging we've been doing it wrong, and that we need to do it in a different way. And the first one I'm going to mention is that in this global community, we're all global citizens of planet Earth, we listen to and abide by the sayings and the decisions of the rich, not the poor. And we need to reverse that. We need to bring the voices, the decision-making, the ideas, the activities of the poorest people on the planet as our number one priority. Number one priority. And we don't do that by any means. We don't do it in a single country. The rich people in the country think of themselves and make policies for themselves. They don't make policies for their poor citizens, and we certainly don't make it at the global level. So how do we do that? That's a reversal I think we need to be putting our minds to and seeing how we do it. And we have on our panel today the chair of the Least Developed Countries Group, Madeleine Diouf-Sarr from Senegal. We've been working together in the UN Framework Convention on getting the voices of the least developed countries. We've made some progress, but not enough. So how do we make more? That's the first dimension. The second dimension is an age dimension. We, the old people, and I count myself now amongst the older people, have got it wrong. And we've failed to leave behind for the next generation a healthy planet. We know that. We accept that. They keep telling us that, and we listen, but we don't do anything. So we have to think about how are we going to respond to them. And so my second business unusual recommendation of reversing the way we do things is to not think of this place and the people who have badges to get in as the people who are important. The people who are important were the ones who are on the streets a little while ago today. Young people demonstrating. They are our masters. We are not the masters. They are the masters. We should be reporting to them. We should be abiding to the instructions that they give us. We need to do that sincerely, not just give them, space, bring them up here, give them 3 minutes to give a talk and say a talk on behalf of younger generation. We do that. We know tokenism is built into this system. We do, as Ingvild said, checklisting everything. You can tick everything, and you think you've done it, you haven't done it. Nowhere near done it. And so we really need paradigm shifts in thinking, and the older generation need to be the ones who make that change. Okay? Business as usual is not going to work. We need to give the opportunity to the younger generation. And my third and final change in dimension or ways of thinking is, as global citizens, how do we interact and develop global movements and activities other than having these UN-type summits? Okay, we seem to be, this is the only default. You have a big summit, Sweden has invited us here, we have a big UNEP meeting, delegates from all the countries, the major groups. There's a process involved. It's a good process, I'm not saying it's a bad process, but it's ineffective. It just doesn't result in any major change. And so we need to rethink, how do we act as a global community? And again, I will use the example of young people. Today was Friday, Every Friday, the school kids all over the world in this loosely knit conglomeration called Fridays for the Future, they come out inspired by Greta Thunberg, a teenager from Sweden who used to do this all on her own, sat in front of the parliament with a placard saying, this is not right. We need to change. And school kids all over the world, they have been coming out today. They demonstrated outside in Stockholm today. They demonstrated in cities all over the world, including in my country, in Bangladesh. They are getting together. They are mobilizing together. We perhaps don't even realize how much they are organizing together. But we need to make them, empower them to be able to do it, enable them to do it, and listen to them when they tell us what we need to be doing. We aren't doing that enough. So in particular, I'll end with the gender dimension of this. Young people, and in particular young girls, of all the countries in the world are our masters. They are the ones we should be aiming to listen to and support and empower and enable to change things so that the next 50 years is not a repetition of the last 50 years, because we did not do a good job in the last 50 years. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Salimul Hook from ICAD. And thank you for highlighting the need for global governance that brings in the voices and that turn things around, I think, in terms of how we do make decisions around these issues. Now I'm very delighted also to invite Sarah Hendricks, Director of Program Policy and Intergovernmental Division from UN Women. UN Women is also a member, a very active member of the Gender Expert Group of GDKP. Sarah is former Director for Gender Equality also at the Gates Foundation, and she's here today to talk about the UN Women's feminist plan for sustainability and social justice beyond COVID-19. So delighted to have you. Please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ingvild, for that very kind introduction. And indeed, UN Women is absolutely delighted to be part of the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership and a founding member of the Gender Expert Group. Indeed, it is a key forum to share expertise, to identify pathways for just transitions to an environmentally sustainable future. As Ingvild has highlighted, I'm going to be speaking about a feminist plan for just recovery. And to do so, I'll draw on a few different and certainly very much linked strands of UN Women's work. The first is our latest flagship report called Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for sustainability and social justice, which provides a feminist roadmap for getting out of the COVID-19 crisis. It includes 3 pillars, specifically on jobs, on care, and on climate. The second is I'll draw also on the 66th session of the agreed conclusions of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. For the very first time in its entire history this year, focused on gender equality and climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. And third, I'll also draw in generation equality, an effort really to take Dr. Hook's call of building platforms that put youth voices at the center, and that are intentionally and meaningfully bringing stakeholders to turbo boost changes and results on gender equality. I'd love for us to look first for a moment, before we turn to solutions, at the context, at this current very troubling global context we're in and what this means for gender equality. And then let's take a look at what the feminist solutions could be. And certainly as we think about the current context, it's very well regarded now that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on women and girls, on gender equality, on women's rights. COVID-19 has, if you will, been a revealer of a series of underlying structural problems, a trio of interlocking crises that need to be addressed as part of the recovery. So first crisis is a job and livelihoods crisis, which has pushed large swaths of women behind and increased their vulnerabilities to shocks. The data is staggering. Income inequalities have increased more than any other time in history, right now. Income inequalities have increased more than any other time in history. We also point to a global care crisis that has left millions without the support they need, while imposing harsh choices and enormous costs on women and girls, and an accelerating climate and environmental crisis, taking its toll disproportionately on the poorest countries and the most marginalized women and girls. In recent months, these problems have been further exacerbated by the fallout of the war in Ukraine, which has triggered huge spikes in the prices of food and fuel, and inflation hikes, all of which are having, again, worrying impacts on women and girls. And meanwhile, as we approach COP27 in Egypt later this year, the UN warns that the world is on the edge of an abyss, a triple planetary crisis with little sign that member states or corporations anywhere are close to adopting the kinds of wholesale changes that are needed to prevent disaster. And while there's been a lot of hope, there is also a lot of rhetorical commitment to making the COVID recovery a green one. So what would a feminist and green recovery look like? And how can we be sure that as we emerge from COVID-19, we make the transition in a gender-just way, in a gender-just transition? And there are 4 ideas that I'd like to highlight, drawing from those sources that I mentioned before. Financing is the first, which is always probably one of the most important questions to ask as a feminist. Where is the money? In fact, I think it's part of the calling card of being a feminist to ask the question, where is the money? The answer is that at the moment, there's not enough of it, and it's not going to where it is needed most. Meeting the Paris Agreement for 1.5 degrees will cost in the range of $1.6 to $3.8 trillion per year. And wealthy countries, as we know, bear the responsibility for the bulk of this. We also know that the $100 billion target made in 2019 to support developing countries with adaptation and mitigation efforts is very far from being achieved. And it is so critical that, as well as mitigation, adequate climate finance is directed towards gender-responsive adaptation in the poorest countries, in recognition of the severe impacts climate change and biodiversity loss has made, and that those countries are already experiencing. Supporting women to adapt their livelihoods to a changed climate, to access new green jobs, as well as climate resilient social protection, and in particular care systems, is a priority, or should be a priority, for adaptation finance. But only about 1/4 of climate finance is directed towards adaptation. And the share of all climate finance that goes to the least developed countries and small island developing states is 21% and 3% respectively. And all this points to the fact that those who have done the least to cause environmental destruction, poor women in poor countries, and especially young women, are least likely to receive support. And particularly all the more so for women who are leading the charge on climate justice action, for women's rights organizations and youth-led organizations. Scaling up financing for gender equality on climate is absolutely a priority we must see. As well as financing, the second area is partnerships, another key foundation for a gender-just feminist transition. To illustrate this point, I would like to focus on the transformation of agriculture, which is critical to achieve environmental sustainability. We know that the food sector is a major source of climate and environmental destruction. We know this. We know that monoculture ag has resulted in less varied, less nutrient-rich diets, requires high levels of chemical inputs, which contribute to carbon emissions and erode biodiversity and soil quality. Agroecology, on the other hand, can be a central component of more sustainable food systems. Based on bottom-up partnerships with local communities and farmers, agroecology reduces the use of inputs that require fossil energy and increase emissions, offers unmatched benefits to biodiversity and soil health, and we know can improve nutrition by supporting diversified and balanced diets. And the good news is that agroecology can support gender equality. They go together. With low startup and production costs, climate-resilient techniques, and stable yields, agroecology is more affordable, less risky for women, especially female smallholder farmers, than ag approaches that require those large amounts of land and ongoing investments into costly inputs. The growing movement, which is inspiring on agroecology, is driven by civil society organizations, but we know governments can be supportive partners. For example, by promoting public procurement to provide markets for women's agroecological produce. A gender-just, a feminist transition requires new partnerships between governments, national and local, and between small and medium-sized enterprises, between social movements, between local communities that can harvest environmental transformations to benefit women and promote sustainable livelihoods for all. And agroecology is just one example of those partnerships. Data is the third area I'd like to highlight, Assessing progress towards gender-just transitions will require further development of data and metrics to capture the nexus between gender and the environment. I have been shocked at the paucity of data on that nexus. If you go to look at it, you will not find the data. It is not there. That is the truth. Mainstreaming gender in environment statistics is not just about compiling, however, sex disaggregated data, which is methodologically challenging for environmental goals at a macro level. It also requires data which captures socially constructed vulnerabilities and the special needs, challenges, and priorities of all genders in relation to the environment. It's this kind of data that will support greater accountability and progress towards environmental sustainability and gender equality. Data absolutely matters to feminist and gender-just transitions. And finally, the last point is around accountability. Final area for gender-just transitions. Data fosters accountability, but to move to a more sustainable and just economy, we need to change not just what we do, but how we do it. An inclusive, accountable, and rights-based feminist politics could reinvigorate democratic processes and form the basis of a new social contract that delivers sustainability and social justice. Let's remember that on the environment, on climate, it is civil society organizations with Indigenous women, with young feminists, with youth voices, with LGBTQI feminists at the forefront. They are driving the agenda. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, in many instances, we have seen a weakening of democracies. We have seen a disconnection of state from citizens. We are seeing a rise in conflict in Ukraine, yes, but also in Yemen, also in Ethiopia, also in Myanmar, also in Afghanistan, and others. They remind us of how the gains on gender equality are so fragile. They sit on that fragile precipice. They can so quickly unravel. In the context of COVID-19, a feminist policy advocacy has been relentless, and yet women have remained excluded from major decision-making spaces, even on COVID-19. We've taken a look at the data, and here it is. Our research showed that in 130 countries, COVID-19 national task forces included seats for 24% of women, or 24% of all seats were held by women. And gender parity only was achieved in 7% of task forces. Breaking the vicious cycle of economic insecurity and environmental destruction and exclusionary politics requires a shift in power relations that reconnects governments with the constituencies that they are meant to serve. One of the efforts that UN Women is undertaking is something called Generation Equality, which seeks to do just that, to support women and girls to become effective and powerful leaders and actors for sustainable development, including through multi-stakeholder platforms that bring actors together, especially on an action coalition on feminist action for climate justice. Through this action coalition, as well as our partnership with Green Growth Knowledge Partnership, we are really looking forward and being very intentional about how to advance forward a feminist ambition of Stockholm+50, of COP27, so that we can drive forward a healthy and sustainable future for all people and planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah Henriks from UN Women. That was excellent. I will not try to summarize the wealth of information and suggestions for how to prioritize. So much work to do. So I would like to now call our 4 panelists up on the stage. So please, all 4 of you, if you could enter this way, that would be great. And I'll introduce you. So if you can take your seats, it's a great honor, tremendous pleasure to have a very distinguished panel from different parts of the sector that we are working on these issues in different ways.
Thank you.
So if I may start by just the introduction, let me start over there with Madame Madeleine Diofsar. She is the UNFCCC LDC chair, so leading the LDC group in the UNFCCC negotiations, also head of climate change division in the government of Senegal in the Ministry of Environment. Probably as a chair of the UNFCCC, she may be the chair of the LDC group that has the most impact under any of the environmental conventions. So it's a great honor to have you here with us today. And then we have Bafna Chowdhury, founder and principal coordinator of the Indigenous, which is an indigenous youth-led NGO for knowledge sharing between indigenous communities on 3 continents and the general public. And they leverage that, as youth do very often, through technology. Great to have you here, Bafna. We also have Sheila, Dr. Sheila Opara-Ocha with us. She is director of Energia, the international women's network on gender and sustainable energy, also chairing the technical advisory group for SDG 7, hosted by or convened by UNDESA. She's an award winner of the Carnot Prize in 2021 for her impact on energy policy. So welcome to you, Sheila. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Pem Narayan Kandel, Secretary at the Ministry of Forests and Environment, the government of Nepal, with a long-standing career focused particularly on forestry, climate change, and environmental issues. So welcome to all of you. Now, I hope to have time also to take some questions from the audience, primarily the audience in the room, unfortunately, due to technical complications, I think. But if I can start with you, Sheila. So the energy transition, so central to climate action and so central to actually a whole range of SDGs, an accelerator of SDGs. So in the energy transition, how could we define an just energy transition, and what are the issues that you are tackling every day in your work?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me first say, I think I'm really pleased and honored to have been invited to participate in this panel, and also a very diverse panel. Intersectionality is where the conversation starts and really makes progress. And Energy was also honored to be part of the gender expert group. And in the months that we met to prepare for Stockholm+50, a key question that we posed to ourselves, it was, what is the pathway towards a gender-just transition to net zero? And 2 things became very clear to us. The first was that before you get to net zero, you have to achieve the 2030 agenda. In fact, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is critical and central to achieving the 2050 climate targets. So that was one. The second one was that energy was cross-cutting and an enabler to both ambitions. Reason being, energy is required for our economic growth. Governments start and fall if they don't deliver power to their constituencies. The second was how energy is really central to our social and human development. And indeed, as we'd heard before, energy is also really central to environmental and climate mitigation and adaptation measures. But when we started looking at the nexus between climate, energy, and gender, it was shocking how many challenges and barriers there were. So when you say what the issues are, and I think it really is important that we move forward from only discussing what the low-hanging fruits are to really looking at what are the root causes of inequality. So I really appreciate the context analysis that was there before. And we find this, unfortunately, also when we look at the intersectionality of climate, gender, and energy. And what are these? What are these? The first is energy poverty. And I know I'm from a continent in Africa, and sometimes we say, let's not talk about poverty, but I think if we're going to make progress, then we have to look at that. That we find that the lack of energy access disproportionately impacts women. The majority of people, the 2.6 billion people without access to clean cooking, and the almost 800 million people without access to electricity, well, most of those are women. Living in poor, remote communities. And the lack of energy means that they spend more time collecting fuel, collecting water, so it's time poverty. And it's time poverty at the opportunity cost of productive activities for enhancements, etc. The other one was when we took a look at what the enabling environment was, we were really disappointed to find that even there, only 1/3 of the energy policies and strategies are gender responsive. And in the NDCs, women's empowerment and gender equality as a cross-cutting issues was only in 22% of the updated NDCs. When it comes to finance, only 10 donors are supporting ODA on the entire, about 93% of the ODA that goes to gender equality in the energy sector is only supported by 10 donors. And on the reverse, you look at the OECD countries, only 9% of those, the gender marker, have gender equality as a marker for their energy portfolio. Again, when it comes to, when we look at the business and institutional level, we find that in the best case scenario in the renewable energy sector, only 1/3 of jobs are occupied by women, and those are mainly in administrative positions and not in leadership and technical roles. And a lot of the businesses of women in the energy sector and in the formal sector, which, anyway, I have issues with the informal sector because everybody pays someone, whether it's paying your local administrator, your market registration, everyone pays that. But anyway, most of them are in the informal sector, and that means that they don't have opportunity to access a lot of resources. So these are some of the challenges and the issues. I can go. If I still have time, I can move forward to the solutions, or unless you want to ask someone.
Maybe let's go that in the next round and make sure that everyone has a chance to talk a little bit. So thank you, Sheila. That was excellent. And so much work to do, so many needs. I mean, in terms of access to services, access to jobs, we need the finance. Now, if I could go to you, Madeleine. So from the LDC country perspective, how much of a priority is the gender equality on the agenda, and what does it look like from where you are sitting as the chair the LDC chair in UNFCCC?
Thank you, Ingvild, for your question. Yes, when we talk about just transition, we have to notice a process. It's required to be prepared. It's required to know where you're going and for what are the objectives you expect to have at the end of this process. So this requires a lot of capacity education. So as LDCs, we know that we need to move to energy transition. We need to move to ecological just transition because it's required by science. And we need to achieve the net zero by 2050. So it's challenging for LDCs who are the most vulnerable population, who are also the most poor country. So this is a situation where LDCs need to be more organized, need to have more capacity, needs to have more resource. We know that we have no choice. We need really to be part of communities, international communities, advocating for action, advocating for raising ambition for reducing emission, advocating for ambition for finance, advocating support for adaptation, for also finance for loss and damage. These are key. But we know also we can play our role in this process. Gender can be a good opportunity to scale up green action. You're talking about energy efficiency. We do think that through gender and through LDC's participation, we can increase gender participation through forest protection. So it's linked to energy efficiency. We're talking about cost of improvement. We can also bring what you call it waste management. So how to bring gender in there. So this can be also an opportunity to create jobs. We're looking also for gender in deforestation, gender in increasing land restoration. So there are a lot of opportunity, and Sarah have mentioned it when she was talking about agroecology. So there are some solutions. So how we can really, as LDCs, promote those solutions for our gender participation in this process. So we are keen to work closely with all communities in having LDCs being part of this solution and making our vocable more loudly. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic, Madeleine. And talking about it as an opportunity, I think, is what we do more and more, right? We have really moved the language not away from talking about it as a human rights issue, because it is a human rights issue as well as an opportunity. And we do it, what was it, the quote from the Swedish Prime Minister, we do green growth not because we are kind, but because we are smart. Yeah. We should also do gender for the same reasons. And thank you, Madeleine, for bringing that into the context of LDCs. Now, Bhavna, your engagement as a part of the indigenous community and working together with the indigenous communities around the world, you are really, as an indigenous communities in plural, at the forefront of climate action and facing climate action and climate adaptation. So what would this look like from where you are sitting? What does gender just transitions and recovery look like for indigenous communities?
Thank you for that question, Ingvild. The truth is I'm coming from Assam, which is at the forefront of what we should be calling climate inaction crisis. I'm coming from a place where Dima Hasao has been destroyed because the actions that needed to have taken place 30 years ago did not happen. Indigenous peoples were not included. And here we are, here I am, sitting here as a token. That's what it feels like. Today I was at the march with all the other climate activists, and the voices there are loud and clear, that we need to work together. As Mr. Huck has mentioned, we are at the point where we cannot go back. We are at the point where the rhetoric needs to change. We are not at the point where we can have these same conferences over and over and over again and expect different results, because the money is not going where it needs to. Where I am sitting from today, our communities have lost train stations, access to food, access to internet, and the climate crisis is not 10 years away, it's now. We are seeing it right now. And the fact that I am sitting here saying this to you shouldn't come as a shock, because it has been happening. So to be honest with you, we are extremely frustrated with what has not happened. And if we are to reinvent the wheel, we don't need to actually reinvent the wheel because the solutions are there. Traditional communities have access to knowledge that has been transferred orally throughout generations. I'm sure, Madeleine, you know that as well from your community. And these solutions need to be promoted, they need to be turned into actions. The amount of money that goes into organizing these events, the amount of money that goes into conducting research, we know it's there. The research is there. We don't need more research. What we need is action. We want to see where this money is going. 1 trillion pledged year after year. Where is that money? The local communities can tell you it's not going where it needs to because we are dying. Our communities are suffering. And from where I am, gender just transitions is not even a word because we are at the point of reacting to the crisis. We are at the point of recovering from the crisis because the COVID-19 crisis may have shown us that we can all act together. But if we can all act together when there is COVID-19, why can we not act together for the climate crisis? This is my extremely loud perspective, and I hope you apologize. I apologize for being that way, but we are frustrated, and we want to see what's actually going to happen out of Stockholm+50.
Thank you. Let's applaud that. Thank you, Bhavna, for being loud and clear. That's really excellent put in a frustrating context of here we are 50 years later, probably discussing many of the same issues. Yeah. So from a government perspective, Dr. Kandel, in Nepal and from the perspective of the Ministry of Forestry and Environment in Nepal, how do you approach this issue? What does gender look like in the way that you make policies and program from the government perspective?
Okay. Thank you, Ingvild, for inviting me in this important agenda. This is very important for us also. And I work in the Ministry of Forest and Environment, and this ministry is looking after the whole natural resources. Therefore, participation, decision-making, involvement of women and marginalized group is very important to make things happen. For your information, Nepal is a stratified society consisting of its hierarchical arranged caste ranking. Therefore, it means there is some discrimination. You know, there are some number of ethnicity, and there is big discrimination fundamentally between men and women. Society and families prefer boys rather girls because girls has to left our birthplace, and family and boy can only be the inherit family genes and asset. So, in my family, I born after 5 elder sister, and my elder sister did not access for education, and I become the secretary of the country. See the discrimination, see the differences. She got earlier married. She was even more talent, more competent than me. So this is an example. In this context, we have to manage the natural resources of the country. And yes, things are changing because this is the social process. You have to understand the socio-political and economic structure to bring something different. So I mentioned that Nepal is very hierarchical country and a lot of discrimination are there. Therefore, we are changing the process, policy, and institution. Nepal's well realized the need of mainstreaming marginalized people and women to accelerate the development endeavor efficiently and effectively. That is the issue Nepal has well identified. And my ministry also, Federal, Republican, and Democratic Constitution of Nepal has committed to the elimination of all form of discrimination, building an egalitarian and inclusive society, and achieving economic equality, prosperity, and social justice. So this is the clear direction of the Constitution of Nepal. Sector policies and legal instruments are in place with positive discrimination, because the weak and discriminated and marginalized community, they cannot compete with higher caste or privileged group. Therefore, you have to discriminate by policy, legal instrument, and institution. So that is happening in Nepal. Very good news. So we have sectoral policy. Minimum 33% and proportionate representation of marginalized group have been ensured by the Constitution. As a result, inclusion of and mainstreaming of women and all ethnicity have been increasing, gradually increasing, because this is the social process. Social transformation takes time, because you have to change in the system. Without changing in system, you cannot bring the big change. Social transformation is big issue that is gradually happening in Nepal. So things are improving in Nepal. As far as my ministry is concerned, because I mentioned that we have to manage whole natural resources, land, water, forest, biodiversity, and all. Therefore, women, they are the manager of natural resources. They are collecting firewood, water, fodder, and they have to cook and feed to all. So their role is like a manager, natural resource manager. Their participation and involvement in decision making is very much important. Therefore, we have to, be very clear that policy level change, institutional level change should work more than, to transform the social system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kandel. And also for pointing out these transitions take time. We have spent a lot of time, and I think we've seen a lot of progress. And I think the risk is, and I think that was also pointed out by Sarah from UN Women earlier, that we are also risking that we are going backwards in the face of these crises, just like we saw it in the context of COVID-19. So maybe let's do another round of hearing your perspectives of what works, what are the real opportunities that we see, and perhaps what do we hope comes out of Stockholm+50 that can really, really accelerate us and propel us in the right direction, not downward spiraling towards meeting again in 50 years, which hopefully will be my children and not myself having this conversation. So Sheila, to you first, perhaps. What are the opportunities and what should we take away from Stockholm?
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, let me just reflect on the discussion that we've had today. It's good to see that we do have a golden thread. In the words of Ban Ki-moon, that there is a golden thread. And the golden thread I see is that what we're saying is that if we're going to reach net zero, and if we're going to reach the 2030 agenda, then it has to be just and it has to be inclusive. And I think we're also saying that just and inclusive means it has to be gender transformative and it has to be feminist. It has to have a feminist perspective. And that was very much when the gender expert group was looking at an energy transition that is just and inclusive and gender transformative. We said, what are the key things that would make that actionable? The first was identifying renewable energy as an opportunity to invest in labor-saving technology that addresses women's time poverty and reduces drudgery, but also increases the productivity of women's labor. So that was one. The second one is we said, really having gender-responsive policies, legal frameworks that provide that enabling environment which can drive markets and which can drive actions both at the national, subnational, and regional and global level. The third was really exponentially increasing the financing through gender-responsive procurement processes that are going to lead to real investments, intentional investments in women's businesses across the board, from micro all the way to large businesses and enterprises. We also said, career advancement in the sector was really important, and that brings into looking at increasing the pipeline in STEM education. But we don't only need engineers in the energy and climate sector. You need all other fields as well. But also using tools like mentorship and role modeling was really critical. We also said that, and this is one thing I didn't mention before, but I wanted to bring in the context of what we're seeing. Ukraine is just, maybe the tipping. As we heard from UNHCR, we now have over, I think we've passed the target of 100 million displaced people. So really looking at displacement settings, most vulnerable communities, and energy access in those communities, and particularly because we see this is where gender-based violence is really, trying to look for fuel, etc., and in very fragile settings is really critical. So really looking at energy access there. There was mention of accountability. So in fact, accountability frameworks for us are should no longer be voluntary. We feel that the word voluntary has to be taken out of vocabulary. If we're really going to make movements now, if we're really going to make progress now, it has to be mandatory. So accountability frameworks that look at progress that we are making, but also identifies gaps and helps us to learn and build. And then partnerships. And for us, transformative partnerships is really what's critical, and I think that's been said. They're multi-stakeholder. They're really focused on bringing to the table those that need to be at the table: indigenous communities, women and youth. For us, that is really the game changer here. Indigenous communities, women and youth are going to move away from the business as usual, which are not really delivering in terms of the crisis. And I think we see that when there is a crisis, it's these groups that are able to really rise and make the change that is necessary. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. Some mandatory action. Madeleine, and how about you? What are the opportunities that you are seeing? What do we take away from Stockholm?
I think I just want to add and to echo the education. I think education is something we have to work on for gender, for women, allow them to have access to the right information. I think this is critical. We need also to help them to really bring up the leadership of women. I think this is also something we have to work on. Have more women having political leadership is required. They need to better participate in decision-making. So if I take the case of UNSCC platform, bring more women in the negotiation process, I think is good in order really to ensure that voice of gender is well captured in all decision-making. We also need to increase access to women to finance. I think this is key. Finance for implementing some project. We have in LDCs the Life Hour initiative. So it's how to build adaptation resilience. So how to bring it to gender. So how to bring it to youth. I think this is some type of initiative we need to make, improve and have more resources. Universities, because we're having also an initiative linked to university. So use this opportunity to increase gender education. I think something also is important at the national level, and has been said by Dr. How to build this institutional support in order to ensure that the gender is part of the just transition. We need for that to look at also additional costs related to just transition. Access to energy, to water, you link it with climate disaster, climate risk. Yes, gender will be the one who's gonna suffer. So what is the environment we're gonna put in place to ensure that gender women will have access to resources, will have access to finance, in order really to play a key role in this process. I think this is something we need to work on. And this is also the necessity to build capacity on new technology, capacity on green job. So this is things we have to work. And finally, the issue of loss and damage. I think it's something we need really to work on, how to finance loss and damage, because gender, youth will be, women will be the one who's gonna suffer more and more. So we need to secure those kind of aspects when we're dealing with gender and just transition for LDCs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. And I think one of the red threads through the conversation today, I think, has been sort of this turning the global governance around and bringing the capacity, the finance flows to local levels, to the locally led initiatives. And perhaps, Bafna, picking up on that thread, and the role of the indigenous communities and the enabling environment for the indigenous communities to adapt to climate change and to voice and participate in the decision-making around this. Where do you see these opportunities, and what would you want to take home from today?
The truth is that for us at the Indigenous, we are based in 3 different continents. So we have participants from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and we work in an extremely decentralized manner. At the institutional level, we love having heroes, we love putting faces out there, and it doesn't work. It's the top-down approach, because you tell people, look at this leader, give them the resources, and he will figure it out. But the truth is that communities work much better together. That's why I think what you said is extremely true, that in the situations of crisis, indigenous communities are able to respond because of the values that are inherent to them, which is community, relationships, values that are inherent to womankind in general. And this is something that we do not consider in a top-down capitalistic approach of making policies for people. So what I think that could really be taken away from, perhaps for all of you, because you are all institutional members, is that to push forth for decentralizing the points of power, decentralizing action, because action can only happen at the local level, and the top-down approach is slow, it's gigantic, it takes years, and we don't have years, we have months. So if you really want to see changes, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The solutions are there. Indigenous communities work together. All we need to do is to decentralize those methodologies and to give them the voice that they need to have, to give them the resources that they need to have, and they will do it themselves. I can give an example of an initiative called Global Forest Regeneration. They have planted over 3 million trees just this last year, during the COVID. And they were able to do that in Latin America because they took into consideration indigenous practices of celebrating the harvest, celebrating the relationship to nature. It was not one person who did that. It was entire communities who were able to do that. And that's the kind of movement that we need. That's the kind of energy that we need. And at an institutional level, I believe the global governance should push towards decentralizing the seats of power.
Again, very well said. That's really good. So turning things around and really shifting focus of power. I'm hearing that very strongly, and perhaps also rethinking the frameworks that we have for measuring progress and measuring impact, and moving away from sort of counting. I mean, it's important to count women in the boardroom, but there are also other indicators that we need to come up with ways in the data that we need in order to set baseline and measure progress that is much focused on community, as you say, and the locally led initiatives. So I think that's really great takeaways. Back to you, Dr. Kandel. You were talking about sort of there has been progress in Nepal. It's moving forward, taking up a couple of steps backwards, perhaps in the context of the pandemic. Now, how do you keep the momentum going? How do we keep the momentum going from the perspective of...
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, gender-just recovery can only be achieved if we improve the policy, legal instrument, institution, plan, and providing budget. Sarah rightly mentioned that gender adaptation budget, and way of translating into ground. This is the big issue that I'm talking about. It takes time. In totality, you have to reform or transform the governance, gender governance or overall governance, to achieve a gender-just recovery. So that is the big thing that I'm talking. But in Nepal, we are doing a lot in that line. We have a gender policy in place. Gender and social inclusion strategy in forestry sector is in place. And we have gender budget with different headings. And we have gender-friendly institution from policy level to community level. For your kind information, Nepal is very famous in community forestry. We have handed over more than 40% national forest to the people, to the community for their autonomous management and use. And there is a mandatory provision that at least 33% women and proportionately marginalized group should be participate or involve in the decision-making process. There is a very powerful committee. They make the decision to manage the forest and to utilize the resources coming from that forest. So that is why forest in Nepal is increasing. You see the impact and effectiveness of participation of women and marginalized group, because I mentioned that they are the manager of natural resources. Because they live in the rural area, they have less choice. They are the weak group of society. They should be reliant on natural resources. So therefore, they are managing their own resources. So government has devolved all the power, responsibility, and accountability to the community, to the woman. So more than 43% women are involving in managing the 40% natural resources of Nepal. So that helps a lot. But the question again, Sarah rightly mentioned that, how money come in the pocket of individual women? Does that community forestry, that increase the forest, that increase the quality of forest and biodiversity as well, that helps to reduce the time to collect the firewood and water. But again, is it giving the money to the woman? It is creating the job for them. That is the question that we have to rethink in Nepal. But things are improving. So the message is, if we are really thinking to transform a gender-just recovery, gender issue, social inclusion issue, we have to reform or transform in systemic reform, total reform, But this is the process, it takes time. We have to think, target in that way. So, though Nepal is a hierarchical societal system, but Nepal is improving a lot in inclusion of marginalized group, ethnicity, and women as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it seems, unfortunately, that we have come to the end of our time, and I will not try to summarize such a rich conversation. I just want to say that I think, it's great to hear that, everyone in this room seemed to really be saying the same thing. We need to rethink the way we are doing things, and it needs to be mandatory, as Shayla is saying, not because we are kind, not only because we are kind, but it is because it is what makes sense. It is the low-hanging fruit and the no-brainer in terms of accelerating sustainable development. So I can only hope that we are not here for 136 years more. I don't have that time, and my daughters don't have that much time. We want to see action now. We want to come through this decade of action with real tangible results, also in the context of women equality, gender equality and women's empowerment and gender just recovery and transitions. So with that, unfortunately, we also didn't have time to pass the microphone around and get the questions and the inputs from everybody in the audience. But I do want to thank everybody for joining today. Have a wonderful Friday evening in Stockholm. And to those of you online, again, thank you so much for joining wherever you are.